Mr. Paul Demciak was born on September 15, 1922. Being the youngest of 7 brothers, he grew up in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, working with his dad. He described his everyday actions as picking coal, chopping wood, and shoveling snow for the elderly. He claimed to have lived a relatively simple life and values people from any walk of life. In November of 1942, he was drafted into the Army. Before this, he was working as a crane operator for Johns Manville, New Jersey. Once Mr. Demciak was in the service, he started training to become a medic. This was his skill, but unfortunately not his preference. He soon changed his training to become a paratrooper in hopes of bringing more money home. The goal of the paratroopers at the time was to set up the Eureka panels for D-Day. D-Day was an attack on Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944. Mr. Demciak traveled by train to take his basic training in Abilene, Texas. He described the only place in the world where
That's the only place in the world you can stand in the mud up to your knees and the wind will still blow dust in your eye.
He adapted to his new training fairly easily due to his active childhood. In training camp, the instructor found discipline important. Mr. Demciak said that besides the normal teaching of how to handle a gun, discipline was all they were taught. A few months later, the sergeant called Mr. Demciak up to ask if he would like to do a special job.
Commander wants to see you. I went up to see him and he said, Paul, I need a man for a special job. And I said, what is it? He said, well, I can't tell you. I said, well, that don't make sense. I said, well, I seen a man sitting in a chair, a lieutenant. And I said, well, okay, I'll volunteer. He said, well, you go pack your bag, you're going to go with him, you're going to be a pathfinder. I said, hey, that's a suicide mission.
After this, he went to Georgia for specialized training. During his specialized training, he and other paratroopers were there for 4 weeks. He described this training as strenuous because he had to run around the airfield every morning before breakfast. As a paratrooper, Mr. Demciak had to pack 4 parachutes. His first and only mission was to set up the Eureka panels for D-Day. He jumped out of the C-47 Dakota airplane at midnight of June 5, 1944. The panels he was setting up was canvas reflecting material to mark the jump zones of the main force of paratroopers a few hours later. I and the others in the plane jumped west of Ste Marie Glisse and came under fire from German forces. While setting up the panels, the Germans threw grenades at the paratroopers. Mr. Demciak suffered a leg wound from a piece of shrapnel.
They were surrounded. He soon gave up fighting and threw his trench knife and carbine into a brush, because there was a rumor that the Germans would take your own rifle and shoot you. He was then taken prisoner and put onto a truck to be taken to a hospital in Rennes, France. Before he was taken, the Americans started to attack. When I got near the tailgate, I was hit in the right shoulder. I fell to the ground and sustained a head injury. After the attack, the prisoners were forced to march to the destination of Stalag 321 in Rennes. On the march, he was not given any food and little water for almost a week. The prisoners survived off of black bread made from sawdust, flour, and a rationed supply of water. After a week in France, Mr. Demciak and the other American prisoners were placed in a railroad boxcars and taken to Germany. The Americans attacked again, and this time Mr. Demciak was hit in his right forearm. Now being taken to another hospital, this time in France, the doctors wanted to amputate his arm. Knowing very little German, Mr. Demciak said, Nix, I can still move my fingers. He was then treated with a wire ladder splint. After a few days in the hospital, Paul stated that gunshots were heard in the hall. When we opened the door, we saw the French underground movement had shot the German guards and threw them down the elevator shaft. All of the POWs from camp were taken in the basement of the hospital and transported in 3 different ambulances to be taken in a warehouse in Toulouse. 3 days later, Mr. Demciak was awakened at 4 a.m. and taken to a field secured by the French underground. There, he and 8 other POWs were met by a British Dakota plane, and they escaped to Naples, Italy. When Mr. Demciak returned home, he found that his trench knife he had thrown into the bushes was covered by a Frenchman and sent home to his mother.
It was a trench knife that I had. And what I did with that, it was leather. I got a nail, and I put my name on it, and I put the 508 on it, And somebody must have found it in my outfit, and they sent it back home to me. And I said, the commanding officer, I sent it to his son down there. He was airborne down in South Carolina. He's got it down there. That trench knife, he's going to put it in a museum at Fort Bragg.
Looking back, Mr. Demciak said he didn't have changed a thing about his service. He did the best he could, and that's all he wanted to do. He came home with 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, the American Legion of Honor, and the French Medal of Honor, the Croix de Guerre.
We would like to thank
Mr. Demciak for his services to our country and for the sacrifices he made to help keep our country free.